motion that accepts a progress report and a final report related to the processing of untested sexual assault kits in the possession of the King County Sheriff's Office. So I'm turning the floor over to you, and whenever you're ready, you can introduce your guests.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Greg Doss, Council Staff, and I'm joined today at the table by Chris Behringer, Chief of Staff for the King County Sheriff's Office. And as you mentioned, we're going to be talking about Motion 2016-0432, which accepts two progress reports, a final report from the King County Sheriff's Office on untested sexual assault kits.
Wait a minute. So you're giving two reports and a final report? So
No,
you're
I'm
giving
sorry.
three reports?
I'm just giving one report today, but it's on a motion that is accepting two reports from the King County Sheriff's Office.
Oh, okay.
One was filed in March and one was filed in August.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
So by way of background, in 2015, Councilmember Colwell's pointed out to me there's an error in the staff report. It says 2014. But in 2015, the state legislature enacted legislation that required law enforcement agencies to submit to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab for DNA testing sexual assault examination kits in their possession. The State Patrol Crime Lab is charged with the testing of these kits and also maintains the federal DNA database known as CODIS, which is the Combined DNA Index System. The council added to the 2015 first quarter omnibus budget $200,000 for the King County Sheriff's Office to begin reviewing approximately 249 previously untested sexual assault examination kits. The funding was restricted by a proviso that required the Sheriff's Office to submit two reports and a final report on the status of the processing of these kits. The KCSO immediately began dedicating resources to the effort, and by January of 2016 had 8 detectives that were reviewing the untested kits for referral to the State Crime Lab. Also at this time, the Washington State Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs announced in conjunction with the Crime Lab that they'd received money from the National Institute of Justice to outsource the testing of all but 34 of the original 249 kits that had been identified as untested at the King County Sheriff's Office. There's a first progress report, as I mentioned, Mr. Chair, that the Sheriff's Office issued in March of 2016 that can be found on page 53 of your packet. Skipping forward to August of 2016, the King County Sheriff's Office submitted a final progress report that indicated that every outstanding sexual assault kit has been referred to the State Crime Lab. The report can be found on attachment B or page 57.
57?
Yeah, page 57, I'm sorry. And I should mention one update to the staff report regarding a exchange I had with the State Crime Lab this morning, and that is that 32 of the original identified kits have been sent out for testing to a private lab. Originally, or in the staff report, it says that number is 20, but updated this morning, it is 32.
32 out of how many?
The 248.
So it's still a relatively slow process.
It is, and actually, the Crime Lab indicated that that is because the National Institutes of Justice funding, the grant funding, is coming through in chunks to the State Crime Lab, and they just got another chunk recently that is going to allow them to test 100 more kits, and so they will be reviewing 100 of KCSO's kits in the near term. So that's the good news. It's slow, but it is progressing with the grant funds. The motion before you today recognizes that the KCSO has submitted those two reports and that the agency requires $50,000, part of it to review the untested kits that they have been working on over the past several months, and a portion reserved in case any of those kits have hits in the CODIS database that would allow them to do follow-up investigations. The motion won't release the proviso funds, but will serve as a basis for a release of proviso funds in the upcoming omnibus budget, should you choose to make that change at that time.
I want to ask you a question on $50,000. does the motion call for the expenditure of $50,000?
No, actually what it does is it recognizes that that's what the King County Sheriff's Office needs for the work. The council had set aside $200,000 and then restricted it, and the King County Sheriff's Office has come back and said that they only need $50,000. So likely what will happen is in the last budget, we'll make the correction at your direction to change that so that the numbers match up and they get what they need as opposed to the full 200,000.
Okay, and when will that happen? When will we make the budget decisions?
You will do that.
Facilitate them getting the 50,000?
You would do that in the last omnibus budget of this year, which you would pass in December.
In December. All right, Councilmember Dombrowski, this is your ordinance. I want to give you the first opportunity to speak to it.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and it's been a privilege to work on this with my colleagues here on the council and really take a leadership role as far as the council goes in the state for local governments paying attention to this important issue, which I think at its core is about justice, Mr. Chair. And we had a very good partner at the state level in Representative Tina Orwall, who has worked in the state legislature to pass legislation, which is mentioned in the staff report, to ensure that starting in July of last year on a go-forward basis, that every sexual assault kit collected and processed in the state will be tested. That left the issue of what about the ones that had been untested and that remained in the custody and evidence lockers, if you will, of our law enforcement officers, what to do with those. And she had a panel that they put together, and they're developing recommendations. But the core of the lessons learned from around the country is that testing every kit delivers benefits in terms of catching bad guys, exonerating innocent guys, and delivering a sense of justice and completeness to what are usually women who have this process undergone. And I brought to show members, for those of you that haven't seen it, an example, an actual sexual assault evidence collection kit, which I picked up.
It's all in that box?
It's all in here. It's a 15-step, 4-hour process. It frankly is quite invasive. I went up and met with our trauma nurses, our specialized sexual assault nurses at Harborview, where we have one of the leading centers in the country, to learn more about this. And you can get an idea just of the nature of the exam process by taking a look at that kit and what's in it. And when somebody, in my view, elects to undergo that invasive process, completing it by testing it and having the data entered into the CODIS system is the right thing to do. Now, in this particular case, the council appropriated $200,000 last year to have the sheriff go and take a look at how many untested kits we had, what should be done with them, and to make recommendations on a go-forward basis. And that's what the sheriff has done through a payment of, I think, almost 8 detectives with specialized training to provide for some overtime. They've gone back and looked and determined those issues. We thought we could have, when we started this process, as many as 500 kits. It turned out we had about 250. Each case was reviewed by the sheriff's office to make a review and determination of the original decision there. And there could have been, at the time, very good reason not to test it. Perhaps there was no victim consent to do the testing. Perhaps there had already been a conviction and the detective decided we don't need this. But in hindsight, it seems the better practice is to test all kits, and that's the direction from a public policy perspective that we're heading. So this council's funding allowed that work to occur. We've got the reports now. Importantly, of the 250 or so kits that we had, the paperwork for all has been submitted to the state crime testing lab. Every single one has been processed as far as we, as King County, can take it. And now it is up to the state crime lab as their resources allow, and that's why the important issue, that's why it's important that the state, is getting funding, and there's been some grant funding. It's up to them to do the process, and we've got about 30 tested so far, and that process will continue, and the entry of the data into the database will continue. And so I just think this is a moment that the council should be pleased with our work on it. I really appreciate Sheriff Urquhart's participation. He brought a thoughtful, and Mr. Behringer, as Chief of Staff, is here, Deputy Behringer, brought a thoughtful approach to this work. There are a lot of issues surrounding it. There are privacy issues. There are judgment and law enforcement issues. There are capacity issues. In other words, It would have been very easy just to flood the state crime lab with every kit, but that could imperil the prosecution of current cases or the investigation of current cases. So what's occurred here is a very thoughtful review of every untested kit that King County possesses. Every bit of paperwork for those kits has now been submitted to the crime lab, and we are in the process of completing the testing. The sheriff has been very efficient, expending just about 10% of the appropriation with the overtime for detectives, and is asking that we reserve basically 25%, 50,000 total, because we do expect at some point, as these tests are completed, that there will be some information that we want to follow up on. That will occur in the budget process. But I really want to thank Sheriff Urquhart and his team, and I think colleagues here on the council for being supportive of this initiative. It's been a big piece of work.
Before I move on, these untested kits were collected over what time period, Councilmember Dombrowski?
I think I defer to Mr. Behringer on that, but many, many years, many years. And so one of the things we're doing is, in the review, Mr. Gossett, is prioritizing, because you have statutes of limitation, right, and other things like that. So you want to prioritize which kits get tested first. And the State Crime Lab actually has a prioritization protocol, A, B, and C, basically, that ranks those, and they help with those determinations. But as to the exact time frame, I don't know if Mr. Doss or Mr. Behringer knows the earliest kit we had.
Chris?
Chris Behringer, Chief of Staff, King County Sheriff's Office. These go back to as long as these test kits have been available. And in the grand scheme of criminal justice work, the collection of DNA evidence is still relatively new. So over 10 years, but there's probably none that are 20 years old. But we've made the policy decision to keep them, in our evidence room, so to speak, in a freezer, so they're still preserved. And it was the appropriation of these funds and the shifting attitudes of society through the legislature and then through here at the King County Council that acted as a catalyst for us to move forward and complete this project. So we thank the council, we thank Councilmember Dombrowski for his leadership on this, and we're very happy to work with everyone here.
Did you concur with him on the reasons why these had not been forwarded earlier? On some of the cases, we caught the culprit said, yes, it was me, or those
Yes, there are a large variety of reasons why a detective may decide to send a kit to the lab or not. Sometimes if you get a confession, that detective is concerned with his or her case right there. If they confess to it, that detective made the determination that it was not a good use of resources to process it. And they didn't want to jam up the State Patrol's already limited resources as well. And that's another aspect to this. Additional funds were allocated to the State Patrol through the last budget, but it's still probably not going to be enough to process them in as timely a fashion as we need them to be processed. At least to the various legislative bodies' satisfaction.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
We have to go start Regional Transit Committee, but I want to support the work that's been done and Councilmember Dombrowski's leadership on this and the sheriff's willingness to cooperate. I'd urge the sheriff, we're not going to take a vote right now, to make it subject to signature.
It's always subject to signature
Okay.
if we decide to pass something out.
Right.
Okay.
Apologies, we have RTC.
Okay, you guys, okay.
So, sure,
I'm
thank you
sorry,
very much.
Councilmember Cole Wells.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to commend Councilmember Dombrowski for his work, and particularly State Representative Tina Orwell. I happened to work with her 3 years ago, 2 years ago, and last year. I had the companion legislation, and it was her bill that was actually enacted. And I cannot emphasize enough how important this is. Representative Orwell and I heard from a lot of people, and there were so many women who not only were sexually assaulted, raped, but they went through, like, as was mentioned, the invasive experience of having this rape test performed for the kit, and then to find out that the test was never sent to the labs, and then to find out that they were sitting, or maybe they were submitted and they never got the results back. But then even worse, to find out that they were sitting on a shelf somewhere and never sent to the lab. Now, I have to say that what we found is that was more likely to occur in the smaller counties that didn't have the budget, didn't have the staff. But this is critically important. And Chris, I'm wondering if you can offer any comment about the legislation that went through this year. You may have been a little busy at the time, but Senate Substitute House Bill 2530, which was enacted, and now requires the development through the State Patrol of a statewide sexual assault kit tracking system with responsibilities for local law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, hospitals, and the State Patrol to participate in the system. So we are to be part of that. And I'm not sure what's happening with that, if you don't have that information at this point, because it was very recent. I'd
Yeah,
like to get it.
I don't have the information for that, but I would like to say something about the preceding legislation that actually
Okay.
changed state law. You know, police officers have a lot of discretion in this work, and you've probably, in dealing with police officers, you've probably received quite a bit of pushback when you try to change their practices because they're territorial about their work. And there are very few points in our work where you are required to do something. A DV arrest, if you can determine a primary aggressor, is one example of that. But even if you have probable cause for murder, you are not required to arrest that person. That is still up to the discretion of the officer on scene. But frankly, when you take the discretion away from a police officer, it makes our job easier. It's a decision that we no longer have to make. We no longer have to defend. You just hope that the state or other governmental jurisdictions back it up with the appropriate resources to fulfill that. And so now there has been a legislative change requiring every kit to be submitted, and that reflects a changing of philosophy in the state, but we also want to make sure that that's supported all the way through.
And if I may follow up,
Yes.
it was really interesting when we first started talking about introducing legislation, we got a huge amount of pushback from WASPIC, Association
WASPIC?
of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs.
Oh,
And I don't remember about the sheriff's one, but, you know, and mainly it was a matter of resources. They did not have the resources. Now, we were going through the Great Recession at the time. And so initially, we thought, well, we can't do this. We should wait another year and all that. But because of this really compelling stories that we heard from victims, and the need was so great that we went ahead with legislation. So it's really important. And I'm very glad, very pleased what our sheriff is doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
what is the current discretion that officers have in relationship to being called out to an alleged rape?
It's
In terms of, do they have to take the woman to the hospital? Do they?
They don't have to. No, we would expect a police officer to render aid or call for aid if that was the case. But by law, police officers are not required to get aid for that person. So it's, again, discretion is very wide in police work, and I think what you find when you get the pushback is a lot of people just don't like to be second-guessed and defend their decisions.
On that, Mr. Chair, on this final point, as we head toward conclusion, is I thank Sheriff Urquhart, and I did that purposely. I know often we throw around thanks, but I think Mr. Behringer, Deputy Behringer, is pointing to, one of the hurdles we had to kind of talk through and work through. And when we first started talking with Sheriff Urquhart, he wanted to explore what the issues were, because what this funding did and the legislation did was ask the sheriff to go look again at decisions over many, many years that had been made. And I think that would make anybody a little bit nervous, because you're taking a second look and you're judging from a distance, and another set of eyes is on it. And, you hope you got it right. And the sheriff has been courageous in saying he was willing to do that second look, and being open to saying, hey, ultimately the bigger aim here and the touchstone and the guiding light should be justice for any victim or any person that submitted this kit. And that prevailed, and that carried the day. And the sheriff has told me, hey, there are a number of these cases that we think it was good to take a second look on, and we're going to look forward to the results coming back and CODIS to make sure that the right thing was done. So I really appreciate his approach to this. It's been careful and thoughtful and eventually supportive. But I appreciate you making time on the agenda today, Mr. Chair, to hear this, and if you would entertain a motion, I'd be happy to make it.
I'd like for you to proceed with the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move adoption of proposed motion 2016-0432, which would accept the reports and give some additional guidance to the Budget Committee on how to dispose of the funds that remain here.
Okay, and that's what I'm not clear on. We already put 200,000 in, used 50. What kind of guidance are we looking for by supporting this motion?
Yeah, let me clarify. It's actually good news. It basically says, thanks for the 200,000, we really only need 50,000.
Oh, that's
Yeah, so
essentially,
We're always happy to return money to the general.
the sheriff's returning money.
oh, that's very good.
And
Oh,
we-
that's all,
Yeah,
okay.
it's all good news. We're not spending any more. And I want members to know, the reason we put 200K in there was not because we
didn't
thought
know.
we'd spend it all. We didn't know for sure, but we also wanted to provide some funding in the event the sheriff's office could use it to pay for the actual testing. We wanted to have those resources available. Now, in the meantime, these grants came in from law enforcement agencies, and Representative Orwell and her colleagues in the Senate, like Senator Cole Wells, were able to put some more money to this problem. And so ultimately, that's part of why we don't need the full 200,000. We wanted to make sure it was available if testing resources were needed. We don't think they're going to be needed, and so we're reserving some money for follow-up work, but that's it.
Where will the money lie by supporting this ordinance?
Well, the money was appropriated to the sheriff's office, and ultimately, they have spent about 20,000 of it, 24,000, and this would allow them to spend up to 50 if the Budget Committee ultimately agrees. Ultimately, that's a decision for the Budget Committee. We're just sending a signal to them about what we think is the right amount. The 150,000 will be returned to the general fund from the sheriff's office.
Thank you for that clarification. That's helpful.
Are you going to check me with Mr. Doss to make sure I was not leading you astray,
Okay,
like you usually do?
That's right. In short, the Budget Committee would take back $150,000
Okay.
from the sheriff's office.
Thank you. Councilwoman Jeannie Cole Wells, is there anything you'd like to
No,
say on
I'm
this
fine.
matter?
I
All
think
right.
I did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Hearing nothing additional, the motion has been put forth, I assume.
Yes, sir.
And now I'm going to turn to the clerk and have her call the roll.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Councilmember Balducci, Councilmember Dembowski.
Aye.
Councilmember Dunn, Councilmember Cole Wells,
Aye.
Councilmember Lambert. Mr. Chair.
Aye.
Mr. Chair, the vote is 3 ayes, no nos.
We're going to pass this motion out of committee, subject to signature. And then we'll move it forward to the King County Council at the best regular time we can do that. Is that okay?
Unless you wanted to
I don't,
Normal schedule unless you wanted to expedite it.
normal schedule. Let me turn to Councilman Dembowski. Do we want this on the consent, or would you like to say a few words about it?
There's some interest across the council. Let's put it
Yeah.
on the regular calendar if you don't mind.
Yeah, put it on a regular calendar. Chris Behringer, is there anything else you'd like to add for the good of the order?
No, sir. Thank
It's
you.
good seeing you. This is the first time you came. And we have not had to recruit you for actual or possible police work in our chambers. So that's good.
Yes.